Ladies and gentlemen, to be very honest with you, I can't see anything, but I'm quite sure there must be microphones somewhere in the room. And if you manage to grab one of these microphones, I think, I'm sure you will have questions for our panelists today. I would just ask you to mention your name and affiliation when you ask a question. Haha. I see a gentleman here on my left.
Thank you, Peter Welsh. I work at the European Court of Auditors and I'm a CITFA member. And my question is, listening to these very interesting presentations, it seems that the future of audit is examining economic forecasting. Is that something that the panel would sign up to? And what challenges is that going to bring?
So moving from reporting to auditing, I think, Bob, you alluded to that in your presentation, so I'm sure you're going to go first, right?
Sure. No, I do think it's interesting, but if I guess in terms of my perspective in auditing, it's we have 30, 40-year estimates for pensions, and perhaps some of the assumptions are harder. I mean, are more fixed, and you can look at them easier. But if you take it to this broader level, again with the appropriate skills and expertise, I think you can look at them and come up with equally appropriate audit procedures. I think you have to consider too that again we're not trying to say this is a forecast, as I said before. So we're not trying to prove it's a forecast. We're trying to see is this a reasonable projection of what the cost of services would be if we continued our current policy. And so I think that's an important difference too, because if we were trying to hit a particular target as a projection, I think it would be, or forecast, I think it would be a lot harder and more difficult. And so I think the other part of that is the reporting side. When we dealt with it at FASAB, it was very important to deal with the sensitivity analysis and other factors. So it wasn't just presenting one number, this is it. It was giving the reader a bit of context so they could consider these things. Again, I went over the one on healthcare, but there were, I think, 4 or 5 different sensitivity analysis where changes in the assumptions could have a significant impact. And different users might use different assumptions or want to use different assumptions to come up with their conclusions. So I think you've got to look at the whole thing together. But again, thus far, when I think about the social insurance, it's not only GAO who's doing that audit of social insurance at the government-wide level, but at the 4 individual agencies we've had over since 2006. We've got 7 different auditing organizations involved in auditing those. And so I think there's a pretty broad acceptance, at least in the U.S., of auditing. Now, when I say that, if you talk to private sector auditors, they probably question our sanity. But nonetheless, it seems to be working well, and the firms seem to be able to implement, again, the guidance we worked out with our AICPA on how to audit these kinds of projections.
Thank you. Ken, anything to add to that from a New Zealand perspective?
Well, if an asset is a future economic benefit and a liability is future economic sacrifice, you kind of have to do that as part of your current bit of the financial statements audit now anyway. Now, those are probably the most challenging parts of an audit, aren't they? To the impairment testing, the provisioning, the debates about what's going to actually happen in the future. And I'm afraid for the auditors that it's only going to get worse because, you know, you look at the insurance standard that the IASB's coming out with. Well, that's really going to require more effort into this, and that hopefully will break the auditors into doing a good job on that, and then we can start using that information in social insurance.
Just to add too, and I talked about some of the resources we use, but the firms auditing this information also have a broad range of expertise, the actuaries, statisticians, mathematicians involved in their audit processes.
Jan, a CIPFA answer to a CIPFA member, or maybe a personal comment?
Well, I'd actually really come at it from the sort of IPSASB angle and say that really why we started both these projects comes from the objectives for financial reporting And we've identified two, particularly accountability, I referred to that, but also decision-making. And I think that particularly reporting on long-term financial sustainability actually brings out both those angles. It is about accountability for the decisions that have been made to date and their impacts in terms of the longer term. And Ken's also, and Bob have also alluded to the decision-making power of those longer-term projections. Now, it seems to me that both of those, assurance is critical in terms of both of those. And you have to accept the sorts of issues that there are around reporting on projections, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that. And people have to accept that there are uncertainties around these. There are uncertainties in any forward projection. Therefore, inherently they are less susceptible to the sort of existing tried and tested forms of audit. But I think that still has a role to play in terms of making sure that that information is challenged appropriately, and therefore that it fulfills all the other criteria in terms of reporting. So I think it's difficult, but that really does mean that actually I think it's worth doing.
Definitely. No, it should not be an obstacle. Anyone else want to grab the microphone here and ask a question to our panel? I think there's a gentleman here almost in front of me. If the mic could go there. 2 microphones. Wonderful.
Good day. My name is Abiodun Ademusu from Nigeria, ICAN, Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria. Yes, you cannot divorce the sustainability from financial crisis. Even when the goings are good now, the macroeconomic terms issues are in good shape. What are the resilient factors or alternative recovery plan to ensure this sustainability continues if the world should experience another financial crisis?
I'm not sure I got that.
So who wants to pick up this question?
I can hear it.
I'm not sure.
I think there's a lot of competition on the panel to respond to the question. But Jan, you're volunteering.
Yeah, certainly
Thank
one of the presentations in the plenary session actually, I think it might have been Ian Ball, actually picked up the impact on levels of government debt and how they'd actually grown. And I think that's really what the area that we've been talking about then is actually really important in terms of sort of assessing resilience and ability to deal with the risks that are out there. And so some of the idea that actually you need to put together long-term projections that show the impact of policy assumptions as they are at the moment, particularly population demographics, which I think in any country will have a very powerful impact on the public finances. That's really important. And then, obviously, that's based on assumptions, current policy assumptions. But then the real power would be actually in terms of doing some sort of scenario analysis around that. So what are the real things? What are the real risks? And what might they have? I think Bob showed that actually some relatively small shifts actually can have quite a big long-term impact. So I think from a sort of policy perspective, maybe even from a broader regulatory perspective, the more that you actually understand those and the impact of decisions today, that must make it it allows us really to think, well, how do you really, what should you be focusing on, as a government, and what are the things that you can change to actually minimise the level of risk going forward?
I think this question from the ICANN colleague on resilience is very important. I mean, have you seen, Ken, you were talking about politicians, right? Have you seen any engagement of politicians on this whole issue of longer-term resilience and how they respond to the challenge?
By some, not by all, not by any. But, well, you know, Harold Wilson, famous for saying a week is a long time in politics, and he seems to have joined up with a whole group of economists that follow Keynes that sort of says that in the long run we're all dead, so it doesn't matter. But in actual fact, that approach just hasn't been working. You know, we've just seen it with the 2008 fiscal crisis, and so the attention has to go to sustainability. And I think Ian is right. What actually connects with that is not so much talking about what will happen in 5, 10, 20 years when the politicians will no longer be around, but in the period that you are in power, are you leaving the finances more resilient or less resilient? And being resilient is actually the key to being sustainable. Mm-hmm. It's keeping that balance that we had in that slide. The more balanced you are, the more resilient you are. And so measure that, and then the politician of the day, the week, the hour can be held accountable for that, for the decisions they're making. But I do fear that putting things long run out in the future, well, we know how good politicians are at kicking the can down the road. So we actually have to hold them account for today.
I guess it also depends whether it's the week before the elections or after the elections, probably. but I see Bob is eager to comment on that as well. So.
But no, I would agree with my colleagues here that the sustainability information really provides more of a forewarning of what's going to happen in the future. And one of the issues that we dealt with, one of the reasons why cost of delay was a prominent feature in our reporting, is we wanted to communicate that if you delay policy changes to narrow this gap, it's going to be a lot more painful and more difficult in the future because we were concerned as a board that message be communicated. So it's not wait till the emergency is upon us, think about doing something now. I would suggest, and again, as I said in the beginning, these are my personal views, that the government as a whole in the United States, I think, is using the model of long-term sustainability and thinking about it. Again, we had a bipartisan commission a few years ago that actually studied it and came up with policy alternatives. So I think in terms of analysis, it is important. What we haven't been successful in doing is reaching agreement or consensus on what those policy changes should be, whether they should be revenue, whether it should be cost. So I think as a vehicle of analysis, it's a very important function today. It's just, we need to keep that out there and keep the political process going and again, demonstrate what the impacts of some of these changes they have made in laws are having and whether or not they're in fact sufficient. The interesting point I raised earlier was when we passed the American Taxpayer Relief Act, I think the impact on our sustainability was about $3 trillion. So it did have a significant impact, but perhaps not as much as some people thought it might have. And so it does show in reality what those impacts are on a reasonable estimate. So many of our budget projections are relatively short-term, 5 or 10 years, and so this carries it out on a lot longer basis.
Okay. Thank you. I think we still have time for one question if, and really if, it is a short question that can cope with a short answer. So is your question short?
Lawal Itopa Lamidi, ICANN Nigeria, Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria. My question is going to be short, like a lady's miniskirt.
Sorry?
I can't hear you.
We couldn't hear you, I'm sorry. That was too short.
My main concern has to do with making sustainability reporting more understandable to users of financial statement, especially those who are actually not involved in managing government business. So looking forward, how do we further structure, or what kind of details do we put in sustainability and service delivery reporting system to ensure that it is understandable by all users of financial statement?
Well, I think the debate on the understandability, if that word exists, of private sector accounting is not over and is a long debate, but would you guys have a short answer to that matter in the public sector?
I think the challenge actually is, as you say, it's presenting the information in an understandable fashion, and that's why certainly in terms of in terms of both pieces of guidance, we're saying that the detail can be presented elsewhere. What you need is the headlines in your general purpose financial report, which will actually support users in terms of understanding what has actually happened and really fulfilling that accountability. So the information has to be clear, has to be clearly presented, and there's a lot of detail that goes underneath it. It should be the headlines at the top. And actually, Bob's got his report open, and I think that, to me, is always a very good example. It's got some clear graphs in it, and it's got some clear messaging. And actually, if we're committed to transparency and accountability, being clear about what these messages really are is important. I think that's a good example of some really powerful information that demands some answers.
Thank you, Jan. I think Ken and Bob have basically 30 seconds to add to that.
I would just say we've been producing this for about 5 or 6 years, and it's worked out very well, and it is very simple, and the bottom line message is fairly clear in here that we can't continue our current policies, and the impact would be significant if we don't change those policies. So I think that message is getting out to the public relatively clearly. We've gotten a lot of good response to that message in here.
People focus on one or two things, so they don't focus on the whole raft of information that's provided. I do think that if your fiscal performance measure is your fiscal performance target is an accrual measure, then you get around a lot of the issues you have if it's a cash measure. If it's a cash measure, you're incentivized to push payments back, bring receipts forward. You're incentivized to defer paying salaries and pay pensions later, to defer paying maintenance and make payments later, to defer your capital expenditure. Or if you do the capital expenditure, do it on PPP and pay it over 50, 60 years later. So your cash budget's looking good. I do think the quality of the measure is important, and if your fiscal target is of better quality, you don't have those bad incentives coming from it. You actually get good incentives, so that the data and the incentives do connect very much together.
Well, I think I'm unfortunately going to have to bring this discussion to a close. I think that was a very interesting discussion. And a very stimulating one. In my opening remarks, I was saying that I think this is a typical issue where we in the profession actually can demonstrate our commitment to the public interest and our contribution to society. Well, I must say that after having listened to the three of you, I'm even more convinced of that. And I think after this wonderful Congress, what we should all do here in this room and beyond is go back home and really stand for this and advocate these best practices. So I'd like to really thank the three of you. You've done a great job. Thank you very much.